dozens of directives and decrees, acts, requirements and prohibitions, even church curses and anathemas. All of this has been used to destroy a language that purportedly never existed. Russia has been oppressing the Ukrainian language for several centuries. Tsarist Russia introduced censorship and control over the printing of books in Ukrainian back in the 17th century. Tsar Peter the Great banned church sermons in the ancient Ukrainian language, and Catherine the Great Russified education in the Ukrainian lands. In 1863, Pyotr Valuyev, the Tsarist Minister of the Interior, issued an infamous circular banning the publication of most books in, quote, Little Russian, i.e. Ukrainian language. The Ems Ukaz finished the job. It completely banned printing, teaching children, concerts and performances in Ukrainian. The intention was clear: to finally oust the language from the cultural sphere. This would have been the case if not for the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917, which swept away Tsarist prohibitions and censorship. The revolution paved the way for a brief revival in the 1920s, later called Executed Renaissance. In the late 1920s, the Soviet Union began repressing Ukrainian linguists, scholars, and writers. The USSR deliberately and systematically eliminated the Ukrainian language, along with millions of its speakers. The Holodomor of 1932-1933 was a terrible act of genocide against the Ukrainian people. Its purpose was to strip Ukrainians of their identity. While subjecting millions of Ukrainians to starvation, the authorities simultaneously suppressed the Ukrainian language. The spelling was forcibly brought closer to Russian, and entire sections of specifically Ukrainian vocabulary were purged from dictionaries. A few years later, in 1937, the regime carried out another wave of repressions against Ukrainian writers, artists, and intellectuals. Then the authorities began to actively form a new ethno-national community, the Soviet people. It was imperative that they speak the same language, Russian of course. This was how the dominant position of the Russian language in education was consolidated. As a result, in the 1980s, only one of the 32 schools in Chernihiv taught in Ukrainian. Those who spoke and worked in Ukrainian, including many prominent intellectuals and artists, were subjected to intense scrutiny and persecution by the authorities. They were accused of anti-Soviet agitation, fired from their jobs, imprisoned, and otherwise persecuted. The Soviet Union systematically pursued an imperial policy of language oppression. In cinema, which was a powerful tool of propaganda, everything Ukrainian was presented mainly in a negative way. Ukrainians were shown as traitors or collaborators. Or they were portrayed as clumsy peasants who only thought about vodka and lard. On the stage, Ukrainian was used to perform folk songs, to glorify the party, or in a comic way. The comic duo of Shtapsel and Tarapunka, a clever Russian and a simple-minded Ukrainian, was extremely popular. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to the largest Ukrainian community outside Ukraine remaining in Russia. Since the early 1990s, Ukrainians have been creating their own centers, schools, clubs, libraries, and community groups. The Kremlin saw them as a potential threat and methodically eliminated them. The Library of Ukrainian Literature in Moscow is a case in point. Since 2010, it has been subject to constant searches, and the staff was accused of distributing extremist literature. As a result, the director was convicted, and the library itself was closed. There are no Ukrainian schools, university departments, publications, cultural or educational organizations in the Russian Federation today. In 2014, the quote, protection of the Russian-speaking population became one of the reasons for Russia's occupation of part of Ukraine. The occupiers systematically imposed their own Russian language and cultural space on Ukrainian citizens. Schools in the occupied territories were converted to teaching in Russian. There is no Ukrainian in the information space, education, and culture. Even the very use of the Ukrainian language can lead to imprisonment or even death. Over the 10 years of war, many cases of abuse, torture, and murder of Ukrainian citizens for speaking Ukrainian have been exposed. Russia has continued to apply its brutal historical experience of linguistic genocide since the beginning of the large-scale invasion. Despite the enemy's actions, amidst war and turmoil, more and more Ukrainians are discovering and coming back to their identity. Ukrainian is and will remain the language of a people who have proved their strength and their right to their language through centuries of struggle.